This is the second in a three-part series on ecology. This section is going to be on ecosystem ecology. So whereas we were just talking about one population in the last lecture, this lecture goes ahead and combines populations. So it's a much bigger picture view. And when we talk about ecosystems, you can study one of two things. You can study energy, or you can study nutrients, and then you can apply those to all sorts of different things. You can look at anthropogenic influences, you can look at things like bioaccumulation, or you're going to look at eutrophication in this class, and so there's so much that can be done in terms of studying ecosystems, but those two main categories are nutrients and energy. Now if we go ahead and look at food webs here, you can see that this is organized into trophic levels. So you guys did the same thing in lab where you put your primary producers at the bottom. So this is your first grouping of organisms, and then your trophic levels move up as you move up. So it's sort of a who eats who, and here you can see humans, as well as orca whales at the top of the food chain. Okay, so you can tease out food chains from food webs, right? You would just look at one flow of nutrients. So you would start with your producers, and then you would go to a primary consumer, and then you'd go to a secondary consumer, and then you'd go to a tertiary consumer. So we went phytoplankton to herbivorous plankton to squid to humans. Okay, so that's how you read those. The other thing we'd like to talk about is keystone species in the food web. So I'm going to show you an example in just a minute of the sea star, and then we're going to look at a different example in class. And the keystone species is the species in your web that compared to its biomass, has a relatively large effect on the structure of the ecosystem. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So in this very famous study done by Dr. Payne in the Pacific Northwest, actually, out in the San Juan Islands, what was looked at is the effects of sea stars on the community. And he found that sea stars really are a keystone species in our environment. So what happens is if you remove sea stars from rocks, you have mussel overgrowth. So sea stars really keep the mussels in check. When you get mussel overgrowth, what happens is the mussels destroy things, the habitat for other species to come in. So for instance, they exclude certain macroalgal species from the area because they literally are doing a carpet of growth all along the rock. And so what was found is that over time, you can see here that when the sea star was removed, an indicator of biodiversity, which is species richness, which is the number of species, decreased. So you're losing biodiversity when your keystone species gets out of whack. And I'll show you another example, a good realistic example of this when we're in class. Okay, the other thing that we want to look at is energy. So that food webs deal with nutrients, and we look specifically at keystone species, and this is an example of energy. So in this diagram in your book, you can see that this is a food chain, not a food web. You've got producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. So here's all your trophic levels. And the other thing that you notice is that the amount of energy in each trophic level decreases as you increase trophic level. Okay. So why is that? That's what we want to know. Most food webs, most ecosystems are limited to 4, maybe 5 trophic levels, and that's because the biomass gets so small way up at the top. So we want to know, what's going on there and why is there only this 10% efficiency rate in this example. And by the way, that efficiency rate varies by ecosystem, but it's pretty small, right? So what's the deal there? The deal is that, especially for this first jump for primary consumers and producers, they can't eat all of the primary producer. And so you have a lot of food left over that doesn't transfer up. But another really big one that happens for all of these levels is that there's so much energy given off as heat. And so much of this, you could draw in arrows coming out of all three of these trophic levels and just heat being lost and lost and lost through metabolic processes. So think eating, digestion. Some energy is not going towards growth and reproduction, and so that's the main reason why you lose energy as you move up the energy pyramid. Okay, so we'll talk about the implications of that on the human food system when we're in class. So we can also look at nutrients another way. So let's go back to nutrients. We talked food webs, and now let's talk nutrient cycling. Nutrients, the nutrients we have on Earth, well, the levels are fixed. So if you look at the Earth, really nothing is needed except for light. So it's pretty much a closed system for nutrients. So everything we have is here on Earth. It's just that it shifts from pool to pool to pool. So we have all these pools. We have the biotic community that contain nutrients. We have the exchange pools like atmosphere, soil, and water that contain nutrients. And we have reservoirs, inaccessible reservoirs like fossil fuels, minerals and rock, and sediments in the ocean. So what we can do is we can look at some of these major nutrients and think about how they're moving through these pools, and that can really help us to understand things like global climate change, eutrophication, and bioaccumulation. Okay, so I'd like to start with carbon. Okay, so photosynthesis and respiration are the main driving forces in the movement of carbon, and you can guess where that happens. You can see here's your producers and your consumers. So producers, of course, are doing photosynthesis and respiration, and consumers are doing respiration. And there are hundreds of billions of tons of carbon that are cycled through this process every year. When you think about sinks and sources for carbon, you need to think about, we're going to define sinks as anything that pulls carbon out of the atmosphere. So carbon in its exchange pool is in the atmosphere. And when you're in an exchange pool, it means you're available to the biotic community. So when carbon is in the exchange pool, it's in the form of CO2. And that means that producers can pull it out of the atmosphere and use it for photosynthesis. So it's readily available, and there's nothing stopping producers from allowing it to diffuse through their stomata and into the chloroplast so that it can be used for photosynthesis. So what are things that pull carbon out of the atmosphere? Those are sinks. So examples of this are producers. So the biotic community. CO2 can get trapped up in living organisms. So all through here, all of these living organisms are sinks for CO2. Other sinks for CO2 are things actually that are in the exchange pool itself. So you can consider large bodies of water as sinks. You can consider certainly things like fossil fuels as sinks because these are completely inaccessible. So this box over here means that the biotic community does not have access to it at all. And so for carbon, something like a fossil fuel is a great example of an inaccessible reservoir for carbon. So that carbon can actually be combusted in cars and put into the atmosphere. And once it's in the atmosphere, it can be used by producers. So let's review. For carbon, it's inaccessible as something like a fossil fuel. It's accessible in the atmosphere atmosphere, or it can sink into large bodies of water, or it can be moved into the sink of the biotic community. Okay, so that's carbon. Let's look at nitrogen next. Nitrogen is an interesting one. It's actually inaccessible in the atmosphere, which totally doesn't jive with this figure. So it's unusual in that way. And you're just going to have to remember that the atmosphere in this case is actually inaccessible. So for nitrogen, it's inaccessible in the atmosphere. And that means plants don't have access to it. And you guys know that plants need to have phosphorus and nitrogen and other minerals and nutrients in order to grow. Make amino acids, make DNA, ATP. It needs that for that, right? But it's interesting that they can't just pull it out of the atmosphere. What has to happen is nitrogen in the atmosphere has to be converted into a usable form for producers, and that's done by the biotic community. So now we're all over the place on this map. We are in the inaccessible reservoir in the air for nitrogen, and then what happens is soil microbes go ahead and convert nitrogen into a usable form. That puts it in the soil. So for nitrogen, you move from the atmosphere to the soil. And once you're in the soil and water is present, then producers can take it up. So then it moves right into the biotic community. Okay, so we're going to be talking a lot about that in terms of eutrophication. Nitrogen has an interesting story to it. I talked about this sort of a limiting factor for nitrogen is the fact that these microbes do convert it from the atmosphere into a usable form for plants. And that pretty much is steady. But post-World War II, we discovered a way to do this on our own. So humans play a role in the amount of nitrogen that is pulled out of inaccessible reservoirs, and of course carbon as well. And we're going to talk about both of those in class. For carbon, we'll talk about global climate change, and for nitrogen, we'll talk about eutrophication. Okay, that's it for ecosystem ecology.